All right. So, so the experimental composition techniques is something that we started talking about on Monday. And the goal of this page is, or this module is really to uh, give you more possibilities and a little bit more of um, I don't know if instructions, but kind of ideas or best practice suggestions, creative approaches to using these tools. Um, and regardless of the motivation in terms of the development of musical or artistic style and the whole trend to be more abstract and more introvert, or maybe on the opposite, being more realistic, that came from interactions with movie and the general change in the culture in the second half of the 20th century, uh, actually before the second half, from the beginning of second century with all the world wars and then the evolution of technology that actually made a lot of these tools really available and integrated into production that was not anymore only artistic or conceptual, but was available to anyone. So today, a lot of these tools are just out there. But let's kind of go back and talk a little bit about what they are. So uh, kind of the whole idea of breaking the norms, breaking the conventions, uh, is something that the lexicon sonata was an example that I was showing. Is one way of a composer who actually programmed a lot of random aleatoric processes and the formal methods, algorithmic methods, to create textures that you can trigger. And this is one way basically to create music with algorithms. Um, so, from the explanations we had on Monday, you should be able to, let's say, use the lexicon sonata and then record the sound output into something like Audacity. Um, but what is sort of like, what's your goal? I mean, how would somebody maybe approach such a composition? Because before we spoke really about chords first or melody first or rhythm first, and it assumed that we are using very specific musical conventions or concepts from mostly Western music, um, either classical or popular music, right? But here, kind of the directive is a little bit more of a misbehave. Uh, so just technically a few words about 12-tone methods and serialism. It actually uses a very formal approach. It takes a set of pitches, it writes them as a sequence, and manipulates them. You can move them up and down, you can flip them, this is inversion, or you can write them backwards, which is the retrograde. And the reason I'm mentioning this, I mean, I don't expect anybody formally to follow these techniques. I mean, they're simple to use, um, not very interesting unless you really think in kind of larger chunks of music, because the point of explaining or giving kind of this account of formal manipulation of notes was not so much to say this is the right way to use to write music now. It's more as a constraint that the composer, in this case Arnold Schoenberg, who is kind of the inventor of the 12-tone methods. And maybe you've heard also the term dodecaphonic, dodeca, which means 12. So the method of 12 tones, the dodecaphonic music, and the way to apply this by manipulating the sequence, which is also called serialism, was more of a way to break away from traditions. So the whole intent is really not to do anything that sounds like a melody, harmony, or rhythm. The other method that I already also mentioned was randomization, throwing a dice and creating all kinds of surprising musical events. So John Cage, who's an American musician, theorist, artist, really a thinker. He did a lot of experiments with his own methods. So he was influenced with Schoenberg, but he was also, trying to create his own methods. And aleatoricism or aleatoric music was really the way for him to approach. So in that lexicon sonata, a lot of textures are created by random numbers, and they're based on chance operations. So I think the ability, the variety of using low notes, high notes, small phrases, bigger phrases, arpeggios, scales running up and down. Um, these are ways to create something that has a lot of dynamics and it has its own aesthetics, but really it kind of frees you from thinking about the melody and the harmony, the arpeggio, the rhythm. Uh, so yeah, I can't recommend more highly just to play around with the lexicon sonata because you can actually trigger this by pushing on the keys in the keyboard, and hopefully you can get inspired by just the flow of sounds. We mentioned also Ligoti's atmosphere last time, so really this continuation is kind of just diving a little deeper into the contemporary techniques. Uh, and Xenakis, who was an architect, um, and then moved to become, well, yeah, he left architecture, but he was thinking in big forms. He was thinking visually in terms of sketches and movements and the masses. So he created a computer system called UPIC, and we have a link here to this system. I mean, if you want to download and install, it's the complete system, but there's some very simple other imitations or emulations of this system, like this one, the Pixel Plane in the browser. And I was showing it last time. I probably will not do this right now, but what it actually allows you is kind of to sketch textures visually and translate into notes. So instead of writing a musical score, you sort of paint on top of musical staves. And you can have infinite amount of voices, or at least not infinite, but very dense, a lot of voices. And usually you will be painting some kind of a gesture. So things that look granular will sound as short notes. Big sweeps of sound will be either like chords or clusters or melodies that kind of. A lot of this is actually going to be synthesized not as individual notes, but as glissandi, as moving sounds. Um, but kind of the idea that now you can express yourself in terms of sort of gestures, uh, and think about creating music that has different densities, different, not the rhythms in the sense of meter, but yeah, different densities of events, textures, is something that we'll see later on with some composers like Jason Graves and others who really use that in games as well. And a lot of the composition today also, even in the classical world, in the classical and even academic music, if you want to call it this way, the contemporary music, there was this ideological break between, these experimental and abstract musical techniques, uh, and maybe the traditional, the popular music or the classical approach, and almost you couldn't like bridge them. I would say one big thing that happens today is not only that some of the classical music came back maybe 20 or 30 years ago, so-called neoclassical music, actually way before. I mean, there was this neoclassical, but minimalism. We mentioned this style when we spoke about Prelude with Philip Glass and Steve Reich and Michael Nyman in England, and a lot of film music kind of went back to using chords and structures, but in not exactly classical ways. But then also people who were doing totally abstract music, like the last example we had, um, that was this Martos and Metal, the video in the previous module, that is really totally unrelated to anything that would be, as I said, harmonic or melodic or rhythmical. And now people kind of go back and forth between these styles. And it just added to your palette of expressions. So what you would, you know, what you would look for, what I would look for, what I would inspire you, hopefully, to look for when you do your homework 3 is really kind of tell a story. In what sense? Uh, because it's a little alien to most of us, it doesn't have this nice harmonic melodic structure. Maybe people will tend to think about this more in the context of surreal or expressionism, surrealism, maybe horror pictures. So this is why the setting of the homework is battle scene, but it doesn't have to be this way. But regardless, there's something has to happen. So yeah, all successful works of art tell compelling stories, right? So I'm reading from here. So when you're done with the piece, listen to it objectively and ask yourself, does it tell an engaging story and take listeners on a satisfying journey? If not, go back to the drawing board and just try more. So I pasted now these links into the homework assignment. So if you looked at this assignment before Monday, I think there was only the link to Lexicon Sonata. Now I kind of suggest these additional tools and try to follow these instructions. And again, I will be having discussion section today where I will kind of make sure that we know how to move sounds around, because one of the difficulties with these methods is that at least the ones in the browser, like the Music Lab, Chrome, and the Pixel Synth, they're fun to play. They're very easy, no installation required, but then they play in your browser. So we'll be using some routing of sound and so-called Soundflower, which is kind of a piece of software that you install. And this is going to be in your preferences, and you can now manipulate sounds and go between this and a recorder that is in Audacity. So yeah, there's this kind of annoying technical aspect to it, but I think once we will get it solved, and I'll make sure that everybody feels comfortable and has this working. I mean, really, you will kind of be asked to experiment, find some fun way to create a musical texture and relate this to a story, and it will be your scene 3. So with these little extra technical explanations and the links and what we had, the first part of the experimental composition techniques, I hope, and this gives you sufficient kind of both inspiration and explanation of what needs to be done. Let me see. So I'll stop the recording for now and take some questions.